Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another Thomas Apologia video. In today's video, we are going to be reacting to a man that has the entire Christian community shaking in their boots.
But all of these conversations you're having on Skype, you're hiding, boy! You're hiding! And you know you can't come out and show your face.
They have been making TikTok edits of this man out the wazoo. Some say he hates you for spreading your kufr, dude.
Make it very clear to you, Sig. Let me make it very clear to you. I hate you with a passion. I hate you with a passion.
You despise me. It's
because
fine.
you are a kafir that is trying to mislead people. You're trying to mislead people, and
Hamid,
you are spewing your kufr. Yes, you are spewing your kufr.
Yeah,
and the Quran tells me to be harsh with the disbelievers. And
all we know is he's called Jake the Muslim Metaphysician. Let's roll the clip.
Now, divine simplicity results in what's called the modal collapse of these two categories, necessity on the one hand and contingency on the other. Divine simplicity results in collapsing these two categories into one category and thereby making everything necessary in a radical sense to make everything necessary in God such that he would have no free will. Now, what's a demonstration of this in its simplest terms? As I just said, once again, if it's a key component of divine simplicity, that God, all of God's acts are identical to each other such that there's only one divine act, because if there's more than one divine act and they're distinct from one another, then God wouldn't be simple, because there would be real distinctions within God. So that's why it's a fundamental part of divine simplicity to affirm that all of God's divine acts are really identical to each other such that there's only one divine act, and this one divine act is identical to his essence. And God's essence, classically speaking, even amongst the proponents of divine simplicity, is that God's essence is identical to his existence. And his existence is necessary and eternal. So his essence and his existence are necessary and eternal. That's a key classical understanding of who God is, even amongst the proponents of divine simplicity. Now, if God's one act is identical to his essence and his essence is necessary and eternal, then not only would his one divine act be eternal, but it would also be necessary. And if his one divine act is necessary, then it means that God could not have done otherwise. If God could not have done otherwise, and his one divine act of creation is necessary, then God does not have free will. If God does not have free will, then he's not God.
Okay, now as a Christian, I'm of course going to agree somewhat with Jake here on the point that it is a divine article of faith that God does not necessarily have to create. The world could have been different. So there are some contingent things in creation. However, what I disagree on is his implication that divine simplicity seems to imply what we call the modal collapse. Now, let me just explain in even simpler terms for the audience what the modal collapse is and the argument that he's trying to get at. So, when we think of things in the world, we can think of them either as contingent or necessary. Modally speaking, what we mean by this is a necessary thing is a thing which must exist. In every possible world, said thing is going to exist in this same way. So, for example, the implication he's trying to say for this argument is that the world in which God has created now, according to divine simplicity, implies that it must necessarily be this way and nothing about it could have been different.
It's not possible.
No, it's necessary.
However, this obviously goes against basic intuitions because as we look out in the creation, it seems intuitive that things could have contingently been a different way. I could have moved this hand differently instead of this hand, for example. Now, what we mean by contingent is just something which didn't have to happen in said possible world necessarily. So what is his argument? His argument is as follows. Premise 1, God is identical to his will. Premise 2, God is absolutely necessary. Conclusion 1, therefore God's will of God's act of creation is absolutely necessary. And this is an argument which comes from Ryan Mullins in one of his papers, and in today's video I'm going to address this using the work of Dr. Christopher Tomaszewski. Now, before I turn over to Dr. Christopher Tomaszewski's response, I'd like to just quickly acknowledge a few words from the angelic doctor St. Thomas Aquinas on this topic. Now, in Summa Theologia, question 19 in the Prima Pars, St. Thomas Aquinas distinguishes between certain types of necessity. One type of necessity is absolute necessity, which we discussed earlier, which is these things existing in all possible worlds. And another type is necessity of supposition. So, for example, if I see Socrates sat down, Socrates is necessarily sat down. But he's only suppositionally necessarily sat down because Socrates could stand up, for example, or he could just have not have sat down in the first place. But because he is sat down, he's sat down by a necessity of supposition. And in this sense, we can say that creation is necessary, not of absolute necessity, but only of necessity of supposition. However, let's deal with this argument in more depth with what Dr. Christopher Tomaszewski writes. He writes, what follows from divine simplicity is the necessary identity of God with God's act. But that God's act is an act of creation is a contingent fact and not entailed by divine simplicity. Divine simplicity tells us only that God is necessarily identical with God's act. It does not tell us anything about the effects of that act are. But calling God's act an act of creation does tell us something about what the effects of the act are, namely that if effects are creation. So divine simplicity doesn't entail that God's act is an act of creation, and therefore doesn't entail that God is necessarily identical to God's act of creation. So to show this is the case, I'm going to show that this argument invalidly substitutes God's act of creation for God into a modal context. Now, substitution of modal context does not always necessarily preserve the same truth, salva veritate, and we're going to give a few examples of this. The first example which Tomaszewski gives in his paper is this. Premise 1, 8 is necessarily greater than 7. Premise 2, the number of planets in the solar system is 8. Conclusion, therefore, necessarily, the number of planets in the solar system is greater than 7. But the conclusion does not follow from the premises here, because the number of planets in the solar system could have always have been less or more or something different. So it seems that when we switch out these modal contexts, it doesn't work. Furthermore, we could run the same argument for the modal collapse against Jake's version of God using the same invalid form of argumentation. So for example, if I were to say premise 1, necessarily God exists. Premise 2, God is identical to the creator. Conclusion, therefore necessarily God is the creator. Jake and every other theist would agree with those premises, which would mean that that conclusion would go through if the argument were valid. But thankfully, the argument which he's running from the modal collapse is an invalid argument, and it does not go through. If this were a valid argument, not only would it work against divine simplicity, but it would work against all views of theism. So thankfully, the argument does not work because of how the modal contexts have been switched here. Okay, now that we know that the argument is actually invalid, how might an opponent of divine simplicity try to repair or try to improve this argument so that it actually goes through? Well, the problem here is with premise 2. Now, the opponent of divine simplicity, the proponent of divine simplicity can accept that God is identical to his act of creation in premise 2, because it doesn't follow that necessarily that God's act of creation exists necessarily, unless it's true that God's act of creation is necessarily true. However, what the opponent of divine simplicity will try to do here is they will try to modify premise 2 to what Tomaszewski calls premise 2 star. And this premise is just necessarily God is identical to his act of creation. However, the opponent of the proponent of divine simplicity can simply just reject this modified premise. So in order to substantiate this, Jake, or the opponent of divine simplicity, would have to show that premise 2 must necessarily entail what we just showed to be premise 2 star. And this is done in the literature by claiming that God's act of creation is a rigid designator designating God in every possible world. However, as Kripke in his 1980 paper noted on rigid designation, true identity statements on which a rigid designator appears on one side of the identity sign are necessarily true if the designator appears on the other side as well. However, the claim that God's act of creation rigidly designates God is question-begging, as it already assumes the conclusion of the modal collapse, and the proponent of divine simplicity is simply going to reject premise 2 star. So the opponent of divine simplicity now will usually try to say, well, that's not the case because God's act of creation is intrinsic to God. And if it's intrinsic to God, it designates God in virtue of his intrinsic act. However, this is not the case. While God's act is intrinsic, God's act of creation designates that act, not how it is in itself, but by way of its contingent effects. And thus it doesn't follow that God's act of creation rigidly designates God. Now, what's furthermore is the opponent of divine simplicity may put forward this objection of the modal indiscernibility thesis. So we may ask, okay, let's say this is true, God is simple. How is it that we can have different effects in every possible world? How can God's effects be different? Because if divine simplicity is true, if theism is true, if God is a necessary being, God exists necessarily in every possible world in the same way without any accidental properties. So we may understand this objection to be that if God is intrinsically indiscernible, then his act is intrinsically indiscernible. And if his act is intrinsically indiscernible, then the effects of his act do not vary. However, we are going to deny this because we are going to also deny the principle which this presupposes, which is the difference-making principle. This principle says that necessarily a difference in an effect entails that there was a difference in the cause. However, we are just going to deny this and say that just because the effects of God's act are different does not entail that God intrinsically in himself is different, because nobody wants to posit any accidental properties in the divine essence. And I would assume that would be the same with Jake and many other theists. So in conclusion, does the modal collapse objection debunk divine simplicity? Absolutely not. If you guys did like this content and enjoy this video, please like, subscribe, and share this video so that more people can be turned on to this content. With that being said, God bless.